my name is Brian Droitcour. I'm an editor at Art in America, where I run a weekly email newsletter called The Program about art and technology. And for this conversation series, I have today Cristóbal Valenzuela, who is the founder of Runway Machine Learning, an app that makes machine learning models more accessible for artists and creators working in various disciplines. Hi, how are you?
Hey, good, and you? Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Could you just start out by telling us a little bit about what Runway is and how people use it?
Sure, definitely. So Runway is software and a tool that allows artists, designers, and creatives to use neural networks and deep learning in a very easy, intuitive, and accessible way.
And you started this while you were a student at NYU's ITP program, correct?
Right. So I went to art school at NYU, and Runway was a research project coming out of that program where we were investigating and researching around the creative possibilities of neural networks. It started as a research project, and now it's a community of users, creators, and artists using Runway to create a variety of different things.
And you, you started out as an artist. I'm just kind of curious how you see Runway fitting into your artistic practice.
Right, definitely. So yeah, I started working on different mediums and as an artist myself, and I quickly discovered that my main goal as an artist was to create tools. I feel like my art is creating tools for others to use more than creating a specific piece or a specific work. I really enjoy personally creating systems like this where people can build different projects on top. That's what really drives me as an artist, I think. And my craft is tool making, I would say.
Do you see yourself following in the footsteps of other artists who make tools? I mean, do you think you have some kind of predecessors in that kind of role as an artist, building systems?
For sure. I think we're all standing on the shoulders of giants here. I will always refer to other people building, and that's a long list of people that have built tools in the artistic medium, and specifically super inspired by the work that some media artists have done in the digital space, specifically the work that the Processing Foundation has done, the work that Open Frameworks has done at cultivating and exploring that media arts interest for digital technologies.
So, you've spoken a lot about how Runway increases access to machine learning models. Do you feel like that access has made an impact? Have you seen a lot of change in what people are doing with machine learning in art since you launched this product?
Yeah, definitely. I think a few things have come that I think are really interesting. The first one is around accessibility. So we have literature students, we have historians, we have artists, traditional artists using painting or drawing, who are exploring and working with these technologies. And so I think the first thing that it's really interesting to see happen is that the moment that tools become really accessible, you have more people sitting at the table thinking about creative users and ways of interacting with technology. And that's one of the first things we tried to do when we were building Runway, is to include diversity of points of views and practices and mediums, so anyone can work with deep neural networks and with ML in a very accessible way. And that has sparked and created a really interesting set of conditions for people to create things that I would have thought that were really hard or impossible, and never even thought of. So when you pair a musician with the neural network, things come up that you weren't thought of. When you have a poet using neural networks to create poetry, that also comes and creates something really interesting. And that's why we're cultivating here.
Do you have a sense of which models are the most commonly used? I mean, do you keep track of the popularity of the various tools that you're providing?
Sure, definitely. So Runway it's open, so anyone can add any models and to the platform. So some of the models you've showing here have been added by the community. But in general, I would say that there are two grand buckets of common use cases in the platform. One is around synthetic media. So most of the content you've seen here are around this idea of using networks or neural networks to generate or synthesize images or videos using neural techniques, which is different from like traditional computer graphics techniques. And so, for example, the video shown here is using like segmentation maps to generate a photorealistic image on the right. And so a lot of people are using Runway exactly for this. And this also entails face animation and a few other kind of like techniques that are in the same kind of like space. And then a few other kind of like very common use cases, and I think the overall second bucket will be around automation. We have a lot of artists and designers and creators using Runway to kind of like automate their creative practices, their artistic practices, where you have models that are kind of like helping you automate the boring parts of any creative endeavor.
I was looking at your website and I saw that you have an opening for a something in residence, and I'm
Right.
curious about what the role is of artists within Runway, how you collaborate with other artists to sort of develop new models and new tools.
Yeah, definitely. So that's an open call we have had since the beginning of Runway. And the idea there is that we are really connected and like really work together with the arts community that are and with the artists that are using Runway and want to like support them in any way we can. And that residency is basically a call for creators and artists to think about interesting ways of using Runway and then use those kind of like ideas as part of our residency to build a project around deep learning or ML. We have had so far, we have had poets on that residency. We have had photographers in that residency working with ML. We have had someone who created an installation. We recently we changed the format of it for a bit, and we made 5 residents kind of at a time, like work at a time. So we make like a flash residency. 5 people came from different backgrounds. We have filmmakers, we have like musicians, and we have kind of like technologists using Runway. And that's still open. So I'm just gonna, I guess, remind everyone that if you're interested in like applying to that residency to work with interesting technologies at the intersection of like computational creativity and deep learning, you should definitely apply to that artist residency at Runway.
Have you seen communities forming among Runway's users around certain tools and models?
Sure, yeah, definitely. We have a very active community of users around new media art. So a lot of people are using Runway to create really artistic, really interesting art pieces. Some of them have been selling those on the crypto kind of like world. There's the super rare set of artists who are using Runway to create really original pieces. We have a really interesting community around students and educators in art schools. So our departments and schools across the country and in Europe and in Latin America are using Runway to teach. And so that community has also been growing a lot. Students using Runway to explore new techniques, new mediums. And then there's an interesting kind of like community around research, where researchers at the intersection of like ML and creativity are also using Runway to create fascinating new kind of like applications of ML.
I was also kind of curious. I mean, some people who use Runway and like it also talk about how the accessibility sort of goes hand in hand with simplicity, like using these sort of tools that are in wide use sort of limit, like they're always a bit limited in what you can do with them. I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like as you go on, you're developing more complexity, or is that sort of, or is your primary goal making things that are sort of easy to use and can be used towards other applications?
Right. That's a good question. I tend to think about Runway and the tools we make as like tools for expression. That's like the original idea behind them. So we're not trying to make tools. Runway will never be a tool where you click one button and you get something out. Like what I mean by tools by expression is there's a tool should allow you to express yourself in the manner that you want. And that requires a bit of flexibility and control over how you're using that tool. If the tool just like uses a template and it like doesn't allow you to input or like control how you're creating, then it doesn't really work for expressing what you want to express. Because that's the basic kind of like idea of like working with tools, I think from the very beginning. And so what we're doing with Runway is, first of all, there are 2 things that are important. First, simplifying and acknowledging that ML in general is a very complex technology and set of like techniques. that are required and should be required to be simplified. And I think, like, I guess the similar kind of like comparison there is that, for instance, Photoshop has simplified traditional computer graphics techniques. When you're using a blurring or using a pencil in Photoshop, you're never actually thinking of using the mathematical definition of how that tool actually works. But it's sufficient enough for you to be very expressive with those kind of like principles. And so here we're doing something very similar. We're taking very complex ideas and abstractions around latent space, truncation, interpolation, and making them fairly accessible and easy for people to create, but without being too simplistic, without being like too kind of like simple, just click here and like you'll get something out of the box without you having too much control. And so that's the balance that we're trying to kind of like find, having something that's easy, accessible, understandable, but at the same time allowing you to be expressive with those mediums.
Those are all the questions I have. Is there anything you're looking forward to, plans for the next year, or other final thoughts you'd like to end with?
Definitely. We are working on a lot of interesting updates to the tool. We're making it, like, as I was saying, far more accessible and expressive. And we're making it so more people and more users can create interesting art pieces and artworks. And so if anyone wants to help us kind of with interesting applications, or anyone wants to use Runway for artistic practices, let me know, and like feel free to reach out to me and connect. We'd love to hear from anyone who's interested in helping us build a community on the project.
All right, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Take care.
Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.